So this is our topic 20. We've been doing this for 4 years, folks. And our topic is Creationism in the Science Classroom, and it's with Nick Gatelli. And Nick is a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Vermont. He's a community ecologist who studies the evolutionary ecology of carnivorous plants and the responses of aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates to climate change. He received his PhD in 1985 from Florida State University, where he studied the population dynamics and larval ecology of soft corals in northern Gulf of Mexico. He serves as an editor for the journals Ecology and the Journal of Biogeochemistry, and published over 100 peer-reviewed papers. He's currently co-authoring a field guide and identification guide to the ants of New England. Oh, you're really versatile. And for the past 20 years, he's taught ecology and evolution and community ecology to hundreds of students, wonderful students at the University of Vermont. He also teaches graduate seminars in biostatistics, scientific writing, and scientific speaking. And in his spare time, he is a blues and folk guitarist and vegetarian chef. Whoa! I'd like to introduce Nick Gatelli.
Thank you, Linda, for that nice introduction. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you tonight, although this microphone is not something I like so much. So, I'm going to start this talk with an apology, which is what I do every time I speak about creationism. The apology is in case I end up offending you at some point during this talk. This subject is very difficult to speak about without offending someone at some point. So I'm going to issue my apology ahead of time for that purpose. I also want to describe for you what I'm not going to talk about tonight. I am not here to debate evolution and creationism. And when I say the word creationism, that's a shorthand to a couple of different topics, including literal readings of the book of Genesis, ideas under intelligent design, young earthers, all of these groups who have some criticism or critique of evolution. They all don't agree with one another, but I need a single term to lump them all together so I can talk about them at once, and creationism is the historical term that is used for that. So I'm not going to debate evolution or creationism. I'm also not going to stand up here and recite a number of facts for why you ought to believe the evidence for evolution. Instead, what I want to do is three things. I'm going to start out with kind of a view from the trenches. I want to talk to you about a few stories and things that have happened to me over the past 20 or 30 years as I teach evolution and interact with this material. Second, I do want to provide for you a scientific critique of the creationist perspective. I'm going to explain to you why the scientific community has rejected this entire body of argument. And I'm going to do it without going into the details of what those issues are. It turns out there is a key reason why all of this evidence has been discounted by the scientific community. I want to explain that to you. And then the last part, if we've got time, I want to talk to you a little bit about the issue of how we choose subject matter in our curriculum, how we decide what we're going to talk about and what we're not going to talk about in the classroom. I'll give you the college level perspective, and I'm hoping that in the audience we have some high school or elementary school science teachers, because I have a feeling that the issues are quite different under those circumstances versus what we have in the college world. So, a little bit of history. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. My childhood hero was Jacques Cousteau. So, of course, as an undergraduate at Berkeley, I studied marine biology. And by the time I was ready to go to graduate school, I realized it was marine ecology that I was most interested in studying. So my advisors pointed me towards Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida, as a place with an excellent faculty and great research opportunities. So in 1980, after having spent my whole life in the San Francisco Bay Area, I picked up and moved to Tallahassee, Florida. And now we come to the first point where I might insult someone. Do we have any people here from the South? Anyone from the South? A few. Okay. Will you indulge me in this historical remembrance? And the remembrance is arriving in Tallahassee, Florida, driving back through town, and along the route from the airport to Tallahassee were all these Baptist churches. And each Baptist church had out on the side a big lighted marquee sign that they would kind of put their own individual phrases and signs. So we're driving by, and I see this sign, and I look again. The wording says, homosexuals will rot and burn in hell. Okay? I could not believe what I was seeing. Having grown up in the San Francisco area, I felt like I had landed on a different planet. Now, I'm sure that the South is not that way anymore, but 30 years ago, in 1980, they're laughing, okay? 30 years ago, in 1980, that's how it was. Well, like expatriates throughout the world, I ignored my cultural surroundings and immersed myself in my research, which was to study the population dynamics of subtidal invertebrates in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Now, like most graduate students, I was supported in this work by a graduate teaching fellowship, which meant I taught biology laboratories to undergraduate students for a couple hours every single week. But Florida State in 1982 provided a second opportunity for support. In the summer of 1982, along with 2 other graduate students, we ended up teaching a full-blown lecture course in evolution and ecology. And of the 3 graduate students, I was the first one up to teach this course. And so what that meant was very early on in my academic career, I experienced the single most terrifying moment in the history of any teacher. And that is the moment in which you first stand in front of a classroom to present a full lecture. For those of you who have taught, you know there is nothing more terrifying than the first time you have to do this. Well, I managed to get through the material okay the first time and introduce the basic subject matter, which was evolution. When I showed up for the second lecture, 6 well-dressed young men in suits and ties came in and sat down in the very first row of my lecture hall. And they proceeded to write down studiously every single thing I said. And this was quite a feat because I was wound pretty tight at this time and I was talking 1,000,000 miles a minute, and they sat there and wrote everything down that I said. At the end of the lecture, I went over and I asked them who they were and where they were from, and they said they were from the local Baptist church. They heard I was teaching evolution in the classroom, and they just wanted to come and keep an eye on things. So they were there for a few more lectures. They gradually kind of faded away. I don't think I said anything revolutionary or disturbing for them. But it was quite an event. The idea that the very fact that I was teaching this in the classroom was going to cause someone to watch and keep an eye on this was pretty amazing. And I have to say, I was reminded of that event a little earlier this week. I received an email from Glenn Branch. Glenn Branch is in charge of the National Center for Science Education. It's a large, very active think tank that is opposed to the creationist movement. And he wrote and said, we understand you're giving this Café Scientifique, and that's great, and we just want you to know we're here, and we have all sorts of resources and materials if you want. And again, the idea that in this tiny format here in northern Vermont, these national institutes are tracking this particular subject is pretty incredible. Anyways, now let's jump ahead to 1992 when I arrived here at the University of Vermont. Back then in the good old days, and I see my colleague Judy Van Houten back there who will remember those times, our class sizes were relatively small. So I team taught a course in ecology and evolution, which I still teach to this day. We had about, 60 or 70 students, a couple of graduate TAs to handle the labs. This fall, the same course has, I think, 170 students, and about another 40 or 50 desperate ones who did not get in. We have 7 TAs. We have a head coordinator who keeps the whole ship running. So it's turned into a huge operation. The subject matter is still the same, ecology and evolution. It's challenging to teach this course. This is a second-year course for majors, so students who are biology majors. But most of those majors are actually pre-med, or at least they think they're going to be pre-med, at least at that stage. So in other words, they're not necessarily there to hear about ecology and evolution, and for many of them, this may be the only course that they will receive covering that material. Because of the extremely limited time, it's a challenge to figure out what to teach and what not to teach in that setting. So a couple of topics I do not teach in my evolution course. I don't say anything about the origin of life, that is chemical evolution, before we get to the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. I also don't say anything about the fossil record. These are interesting topics, but I simply don't have time for them. Instead, my lectures are focused on what's called the grand synthesis. Around 1930, 1940, a number of evolutionary biologists, especially Haldane, Sewell Wright, and Ronald Fisher, developed a mathematical framework for looking at evolution. What they did was to take Darwin's ideas, his words, and turn them into mathematical equations that describe the machinery of how evolution works. And those equations make predictions that we can take into the field and provide tests for. This gives a very satisfying framework for teaching about evolution, and it's where most of the focus of my lectures are. In the later part of the course, I have a little bit of time to talk about subjects such as speciation, the methods that evolutionary biologists use to reconstruct evolutionary trees. We talk a little bit about the evolution of behavior, especially the evolution of altruism or cooperation, which is a paradoxical topic in evolutionary biology. And we close with a somewhat apocalyptic look at human evolution and future human ecology. Now, when I started this course, though, I also wanted to have a slightly broader perspective, so I wanted to include one lecture, just one, on the history of Darwinism. So this lecture talked about who Darwin was, what he did in the course of his research. It also talked about the responses to Darwinism. I talked a little bit about social Darwinism, and it concluded with some comments on the creationist movement at that time. Now, this lecture was actually based on a lecture I had heard as an undergraduate in a course on the history of science. And to me, this was pretty uncontroversial material. It's just a straightforward historical look at a slightly bigger piece of the science. But when I got my course evaluations back, I discovered that several students were upset by this material, or at least by my presentation of it. They felt I was being insulting to religion, and this startled me because I really thought this was just a somewhat dry, factual lecture. So for the next couple of years, I kept tinkering with this lecture, trying to get it right, trying to remove what was bothering students. And I couldn't quite do it. There were always a couple complaints every year. Well, of course, there's a big push in the educational world for experiential learning. So I thought, all right, let's go ahead and I will kind of punt this material to the lab. So I designed a laboratory exercise to deal with this material. The laboratory exercise instructed the TAs to randomly divide the students into two groups. And one group was going to take the pro-creationism in the classroom view, and the other group was going to take the anti-creationism view. They had a week to prepare their material, and then they would come together and give their presentations. I talked to the TAs after the first time we taught that, and they told me that the experience was very successful. The students really got into it. In fact, it was a little bit too successful. The students became quite heated on both sides of the discussion, which seemed odd to me because they had been randomly partitioned into these two groups. We did this one more year. In the second year, this is probably something I should have done in the beginning, the second year I went and sat in on some of the discussions. And I was pretty unhappy with what I saw. There was a lot of rhetoric, there was a lot of positioning, there was a lot of talk, there was not much science. So at that point, I shut down that lab and I returned to the lecture format. And the lecture that I give now actually incorporates many of the elements that I'm going to talk to you tonight. That is, I pulled a number of materials from that. The other thing I did for this lecture that I think helped quite a bit, which we'll also do here, is that lecture stops after 40 minutes. And then I've got 10 minutes of time for the students to be able to talk and ask questions. And the students are extremely interested in this material, and they have all sorts of comments and questions. At the end of the hour, I have many students come up and tell me that they were thrilled with this. They think this is the best part of the course. Of course it is. They don't have any new equations that they have to learn, right? So they love this lecture. And finally, I feel like over the years, I have gotten it straight. So I've moved away from this dry recitation of facts to give, frankly, a little bit more of a personal perspective on this. All right, I want to turn now to the Creationist Critique and talk about it in very general terms, and then talk a little bit about the scientific perception of it and how the science community looks at this material. The Creationist Critique, of course, varies quite a bit in its details, but there are three basic elements to it. And the first is the idea that evolution is a theory that's in crisis, and it's basically unproven. And this has been stated in many ways with many different kinds of examples. The second premise is that the teaching of evolution is in conflict with Christianity. And the third component of this is that because there is a controversy, we should be teaching this material in the classroom. That is, our students should be exploring this controversial material as part of their education. So I'm sure that they would have been delighted that 10 years ago that's exactly what I was doing in the classroom for a short period of time. Let's take those different elements. I actually want to start with the second one, this notion that the teaching of evolution is in conflict with Christianity. That's not really true. There are major church groups, including the Catholic Church and the Mormon Church, that have official declarations that their religion is not in conflict with evolution. If we wanted to rephrase the creationist statement, I think we could state a bit more accurately that what evolution is in conflict with is a literal reading of the earth history that's provided in the first book of Genesis. That is the one piece of evolution that is in conflict with one piece of the Bible. Now, let's go to the other elements. First, the idea that evolution is a theory in crisis and is unproven. Creationists have been making this claim for over 30 years. The claim is summarily dismissed out of hand by practicing scientists. Why? How and why would we dismiss this very important criticism? The answer may surprise you. We dismiss the criticism because it's never been published in mainstream, peer-reviewed scientific journals. Okay? And I need to talk a little bit about these journals because this is an aspect of the controversy that's quite critical. It's the most important one for scientists and it rarely gets discussed. What do I mean by a peer-reviewed journal? Well, there are hundreds of these journals. The top ones are the ones that you read about in the newspaper, Science, Nature, Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. They contain the big breakthroughs in science that do get reported in the paper. There's a whole spectrum of other journals of lesser quality and specialized areas that fall below that. But all these journals have a similar structure to them. There is a head editor. Papers are submitted to those journals. This editor will examine the paper first and make a decision about whether it's going to get looked at any further. And the decision will be based on a couple things. First, how well the paper fits in with the format of the journal, and secondly, how well the arguments are supported. If it looks like the paper has a possibility, the paper will get handed off to a handling editor who is a specialist in that general area of biology. The handling editor will also go through this series of decisions. Again, if the paper looks like it's got a possibility, the handling editor will choose 2 or 3 peer reviewers. Who are these peer reviewers? Well, they are scientists who are experts in the particular subject matter of this paper. So these are the people who know the literature, they know the data, they will be able to provide expert judgment on this paper. These reviewers remain anonymous. Their identities are not revealed to the author. They will provide a detailed review, anywhere from 2 to 6 single-space pages of this paper. They'll provide critiques, they will provide specific suggestions for this paper. Now, these reviewers are chosen to have a couple of attributes. First, they need to be experts. Second, they need to be fair-minded and reasonable folks. And third, they need to be people who will promptly turn these reviews back in. The reviewers will also make a confidential recommendation to the editor, the handling editor, about what should happen to this paper. And there are a couple things that can happen. the paper can be rejected outright. The evidence isn't good enough, or the paper is not a good fit with that particular journal, and then the authors are going to have to take it somewhere else. Or the paper may be sent back for revision. This means the authors are going to have to address all of the comments that were provided by the reviewers and turn in a new manuscript. And there is no guarantee that that new manuscript is going to get accepted for publication. It may go through a second, it may go through a third round of review. And the intent through all of this is to ensure that the science is good quality, that nothing has been missed, that the alternative explanations have been dealt with, that the literature in this area has been accurately cited and discussed. It's interesting to point out that this whole peer review system, and there are hundreds of scientists who do this, is all done on volunteer labor. Neither the reviewers nor the editors are paid in any way for this. It is their altruistic contribution to the scientific community. Now, for the top journals in all the fields, the rejection rate is on the order of 95%. These journals are receiving thousands of papers every year, and they want only the cream of the crop for publication. But even some of the second-tier journals also have very high rejection rates. Now, in the sciences, these peer-reviewed journals are the basic currency by which we measure academic success. That's not the case in other fields. For example, in history or English, it's usually books. But in the sciences, it's these peer-reviewed journals. Now, some of you may have read, we lost a very close faculty member and a good friend last fall, Kurt Pickett, a brilliant young scientist in our department. And we will be searching this next spring for a replacement for Kurt Pickett's position. The ad is going to go out. It'll be fairly specialized, but we expect, even here at tiny little University of Vermont, we'll probably get over 100 applications for that position. Those applications will have a CV, a full list of papers, letters of recommendation, a statement of teaching philosophy, a statement of research purpose. But for the first cut, we won't look at any of that. What we're going to do is go straight to that list of publications. We want to see what's the scholastic record of this person. What kinds of papers have they been publishing? Where's that work coming out? What's the quality of the work? And does it fit the focus of our job search? There are many other aspects that we will consider, of course, in their record as we go on with the search, but that's actually the first cut. So having those papers is critical for getting that academic job. Having those papers is also critical for keeping that academic job. All universities put their young assistant professors through a trial by fire that we call the pre-tenure period. It lasts about 6 years, and there are a number of hurdles that have to be passed. At the University of Vermont in the Department of Biology, one of those hurdles is we want to see 5 peer-reviewed publications that are not directly related to the previous work. In other words, new original research that's been done at the University of Vermont. And that's not an unreasonable standard, but it does require this activity for the publications. Without that, no matter how good of a teacher the person is, no matter how much grant money they bring in, no matter how good of an administrator they are, they will not keep their job. So there's a huge amount of pressure in the scientific community for these sorts of publications. So what's the issue here? Well, where does the creationist literature come out? It does not come out in these peer-reviewed journals. It comes out in blogs, it comes out in books, and it comes out in debates that the creationists would dearly love to have with practicing scientists. It does not come out in the scientific literature. And this is the critical sticking point for the scientific community. This is why the creationists have essentially been ignored by most scientists, except those who have taken a special opportunity to engage and work with them. These people are not publishing in the same sphere that we are, so we never come across their names, we never come across their literature. That's why we're not qualified to debate these people. We would have to read a whole nother set of literature that is not in our area. So the message from the scientific community to the creationist community is, if you have a valid critique of evolution, which they've been claiming for the past 30 years, we want to see it. And we want you to publish it in the same venues and the same arenas that we do. Now, I've been a journal editor and a reviewer for the past 20 years, and I know dozens of other editors who work in the same way. During that time, I've probably seen hundreds, maybe even thousands of manuscripts. Not once, never, have I seen a scientific paper submitted by a creationist to these journals, and I've not heard about it from any other editor at all. In other words, in spite of the big push to the public about the problems with evolution, these people are not publishing in the sciences. They are not scientists, at least by our definition, our operational definition of the term. So from our perspective, frankly, these claims are fraudulent. If there is valid scientific information, we want it seen in the scientific literature. And I can guarantee you, if it were to appear in the scientific literature, the response of the scientific community would be very different. We would be extremely interested to see that material. For the top journal, science thrives on novelty. You will not get into the top papers by just saying, yes, here's another piece of evidence supporting this or that facet of evolution. The top journals want new and novel material. There is nothing in the sciences more novel or earth-shattering than the idea that there is a serious critique of the accumulated body of evidence in evolution. Now, I don't know what that would constitute. I would want to see one of those papers. But that material would shoot right to the top of a key journal, and it would be widely reviewed and received. The creationists have occasionally addressed this issue. Of course, if you know about the Ben Stein movie, Expelled, that's all about the idea that there is a worldwide conspiracy among evolutionary biologists to suppress or keep this literature out. But the conspiracy theory doesn't work, and the reason is it would be such an incredible coup to be able to write a paper like that and get it published. Now, I'm firmly convinced of the evidence for evolution, but I can tell you, if I ever came across some scientific discovery that provided a serious critique of evolution, I wouldn't hide it. I'd publish it in a second. I'd become one of the most famous people in science. So there's no way that a conspiracy article will work here. There's too much premium on that new material. The last aspect of this critique is the notion that we should be teaching this controversy in the classrooms. In other words, the argument is, in the interest of academic freedom, in the interest of good education for our students, of course, we should be exploring ideas, including controversial ideas. Well, as I've tried to describe, from our perspective, there is no controversy. There is no controversy about the facts of evolution. Now, there's lots of interesting controversy within the field about the mechanisms of evolution, in particular, the strength of natural selection versus other forces that can cause evolutionary change. There's also argument about the pace and tempo of evolution. But there is no argument about the basic historical facts of evolution. The idea that there's controversy in evolution is not unique to our field. Other fields also have controversies, but we don't necessarily teach them in our classrooms. For example, in the field of history, there's a group that publishes books and has websites and gives talks who denies that the Holocaust occurred during World War II. Oh, they don't deny it completely. They do recognize that some Jews were killed and there were perhaps labor camps, but they deny that there was a systematic attempt to wipe out the Jews of Eastern Europe. And many of these people have PhDs, they write books, they give talks. Well, in our history classes, how much time should we devote to that topic? How much time should we expend exploring this literature from the Holocaust deniers? I think the answer is we don't want to spend very much time on it at all, except perhaps to point out that there is a controversy in some corners. Or imagine that you have an elementary school child who comes home one day and says, "Mom, Dad, we're doing a really interesting module in our geography class. We're talking about the fact that there are some people who think that the earth is flat, not round. And so this weekend I'm going to take some measurements in our backyard to see if I can determine whether the earth is flat or not." Well, these are all controversies. These are all ideas that could be discussed in the classroom. But the notion that we should teach a controversy is not necessarily the best thing in certain subject areas. Right now, in the year 2008, Bobby Jindal, the governor of Louisiana, signed the Louisiana Science Education Act. The Science Education Act has many paragraphs that talk about the importance of academic freedom and the importance of providing a platform for students to explore controversial ideas. Well, as educators, we're all comfortable with that. Why do we need a law to say that? We already do that in our classrooms. But the end of the bill, at least in its original form, points to 4 particular areas that deserve this special legal protection for academic freedom. Those areas are the study of biological evolution, the chemical origin of life, human cloning, and global climate change. So when you see these sorts of bills, you start to realize that the controversy over creationism is not perhaps about science. That's what our argument has been. We don't have the science evidence there. It's not really clear that it's about religion. Instead, it really appears to be a political agenda. The net effect of this is to water down our teaching efforts of science, particularly in the elementary school and the high school level. At the college level, the effects have really not been very strong. I have good colleagues in states like Louisiana and Kansas. They're embarrassed and chagrined by all this activity, but their classrooms are no different than ours are. So I hope that's given you a perspective. This key idea that it is where the evidence has been put forth is the critical issue for the scientists and why all this material has been rejected out of hand. It's not the details of what the arguments are, it's where this material is coming out. The last aspect I'll touch on is the notion of how we actually choose what it is we're going to teach in the class. The big constraint is we really don't have enough time to cover all the topics we want to. Now, in this ecology and evolution class, any single lecture that I give, I could easily expand to an entire semester's worth of material. That's how much accumulated knowledge and information is present. So we have to make decisions about what we're going to teach and what we're going to not teach. And at the college level, the freedom of individual instructors to make those choices is greatly prized. If you want to see a group of college professors get their hackles up, come into a room and tell them that you have a standardized set of material that they need to be covering in the classroom. That does not cut it. We want the ability to choose and select from all of this huge material to put together a satisfying course for our students. That being said, there are still some issues that we work through on choosing our subject material. We're especially interested in talking to our other faculty members so that we have a cohesive program that takes students through their 4 years. So I'm constantly talking to the first-year teachers who teach the freshman biology course, asking them things like, what exactly are you covering in genetics? How much detail are you giving them on Mendel's experiments? Do I need to review that material, or can I jump right in with the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium equations? So we go back and forth trying to establish a consistent curriculum that builds on previous courses. The other aspect of teaching that does control our curriculum is our student body. The quality of students that we have constrains what we can teach. Now, here at the University of Vermont, we're very lucky. In the sciences, in biology, we have excellent undergraduates. And so our department has been able to put together a very quantitative program in all aspects of biology. And therefore, my first day in the classroom, I can start writing equations on the board and I do not receive howls of protest. I've talked to faculty at other universities, good faculty who are doing good research, and they tell me they can't do that with their students. Their students don't have the background to be able to do that. They've looked at some of our exams and said, this material is more like what we would be teaching at our graduate level. We could not get our undergraduates to do this. So those are the constraints, what the faculty want to do and the students that we have. But other than that, at the college level, we have a tremendous amount of freedom in setting our own curriculum. And as long as we can hang on to the tenure faculty system, I hope we will be able to keep that. The combination of having the freedom at the college level to set our faculty and the fact that all of the legislative proposals from creationism have been consistently cut down by the Supreme Court means that at the college level, this material has had relatively little effect. I think at the high school and elementary level, these debates have had a profound effect. 3 out of 10 high school teachers report that they have received active discussion from their administrators or principals that they need to temper or alter or change their discussion of evolution. And I hope that we can hear from some elementary and high school science teachers in this crowd, because I think their experiences may have been very different than mine. So I will stop here. I will close with the apology. If I did insult you, I am sorry for that, but I do hope I gave you something to think about and talk about. I look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, folks, that was fabulous. This gives you an opportunity now. Remember, what I'd love for you to do is to introduce yourselves to the folks that are at the table with you. Talk about what brought you to this discussion tonight. Make sure you put your email on that sheet in front of you and start thinking of some dialogue questions, things that we might talk about with Nick while he's here today. And we'll reconvene in about 10 minutes. You get yourself a basic element. I think all we have left is crackers, and I'll put some more out for you. But thanks again for coming tonight.
Conspiratorial. If somebody had information up, it would get out because they would probably it would get out. By the way, I feel Darwin First of all, I agree with you. Evolution By the way, chapter 1 gives women more equality than chapter 2. Because chapter 2, women are made out of ribs and, subservient to men and the whole thing. Chapter 1 comes along, which is the later story. Nope. But at the end, they say God creates male and female together. Same within the
job of explaining it. It's like, well, one is spiritual, it's not necessarily practical. The other is that would be a good question to ask him. How would you explain to your children if they were religious? That is a good question. These two dichotomies going on in their small mind where they don't really they haven't grown, worldly.
That's a great question. That's really bright.
environmental science and tradition, there were some good innovation that was arising out of where we are right now. So the idea of a new idea that comes out of the culture in which, the data in which it's swimming. So, I don't know. At least in my field, it's very hard to have a totally new idea.
Alrighty, here we go. Wow, I almost hate to interrupt this great dialogue. You guys are having a fabulous time at your tables, I can see that, and at your benches. So this is that period of time when we can have some great dialogue. We've got a couple mics going. We've got mic 2 back there, and I've got mic 1 right here. So, Nick, start out with the first question. Who'd like to start?
Let's see. I was one of the gentlemen that raised his hands when you asked about the South, and that's why now the signs like you described are the reason I live in Vermont now. So, but what I find interesting is that I find this is a very interesting topic to me. I have friends that still live in Texas, where I grew up, and what's interesting is that I grew up I was in high school and elementary school during the '80s, and it was never an issue then. Like I was taught evolution my entire life. It never even occurred to me that someone might think other than that. And then when Jacques Cousteau was my hero as well, by the way. I was a marine biology student, went to a large university, and it was not an issue then either, but now it seems like it's an issue. Does it seem like there's a swing back in that direction?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a swing back. The momentum, again, through a lot of these legislative actions, and also I think with the rise of the Tea Party in recent years, that's definitely connected with the strain of anti-evolutionism that's present. So yeah, I do think that there is perhaps more interest in this topic. It's a difficult issue because, there is public pressure, and the majority of the public do not believe in the basic facts of evolution about the age of the Earth and the origin of species. And so, yes, there are all these legislative attempts, but there is also this core body of people who believe this material. And I don't know how we're supposed to address that, but from our perspective, the science curriculum cannot be decided on the basis of a popularity contest. And so our purpose is to give the most accurate information that we can in the classroom, and these are the facts of evolution as we have accumulated them so far.
Somebody, follow up.
I was just curious. I'm pretty familiar with several professors that are creationists that are in really good schools, like Dr. Ryan in UMass Lowell. He's a creationist.
Yep.
You also mentioned how evolution wasn't really in conflict with Christianity, but I would say I would kind of have to disagree with you there. I know many issues that I would find evolution. One would be the fall in Genesis. One would be Jesus quoted a literal interpretation of Genesis many times. All through a lot of scriptures, there would be a more literal reading of Genesis. So I was just wondering what you would think about a lot of the college professors that are creationist.
Well, again, from my perspective, I hope this won't insult anybody, the fact that someone is or is not a professor does not actually make them a scientist. This group of people that we call scientists, again, are the people that are actually publishing in the scientific literature. So for your creationist professors, my first question to them would be, where are you publishing your material? And why isn't it coming into the mainstream evolutionary journals where the rest of the science community can interact with it? That's really the key issue for us. So, and again, I know that this is something with the public. Someone has a PhD, they're at a university, they teach science, they must be a scientist. But actually, it's a slightly different subset. And in fact, the degree doesn't really mean a whole lot in our circles. It's what's your research, what publications are you doing? That's really what counts. So anyways, that's the question I would ask for your creationist friends. Where are you disseminating this material?
Okay, I've got a question here from the internet. Folks are asking, considering the development of the human brain, what are strategies to teach evolution in elementary or middle school classrooms?
Oh boy, that is a tough question, and it's definitely not one that I am qualified to answer. I don't think I could teach anything in an elementary or a middle school. I think we would have to turn that question over to some of the seasoned people in this audience some of the science teachers here to get a much better answer than I could ever provide.
Is there anybody here that wants to take a stab at this question? Ah, all right.
I'm a retired high school biology teacher. I taught for 38 years in the Burlington school system. And I don't know if you're going to teach evolution in an elementary classroom. I guess what we need to do in elementary classrooms is we need to have more science. And that's not happening in elementary classrooms. There's a lot of math, there's a lot of literacy, but science and social studies, science and history have gotten, because of No Child Left Behind, have gotten a lot less. And when science is taught, it's taught by people who aren't terribly comfortable with the science. So to improve it, I would say professional development for elementary teachers. And starting with basic science concepts. There's the national science standards, and there's a national core being developed, sort of talks about what kids are developmentally able to know and learn and understand in kindergarten and first grade, and how one thing builds on another. And you can't throw evolution in if there's no basic understanding of making some observations and making predictions and learning the habits of mind of science, along with some basic, and playing with stuff. No, being able to experiment with water and some other fun things.
One thing I will say is that UVM has had a program for many years of bringing in high school teachers and a couple of high school students, letting them work for about a week with a scientist in the summer in their lab, with the idea of training these teachers in some new laboratory exercises that they can bring back to their classroom. And the feedback we've gotten has been that's been a pretty successful method.
Okay, do we want to follow up? Is there anybody in the back there that might have a question?
My question is not related to the previous question.
Okay, that's okay.
It seems to me that we've polarized evolution and creationism. And I'm wondering if we were to ask 10 people who say they believe in evolution and 10 people who say they believe in creationism, if they would all give the same definition or have the same understanding. So I'm wondering if there might not be room for common ground between the two.
Well, the first part I do agree with. There is no consensus, and I deliberately use the shorthand term creationism to refer to these critiques of evolution. As to the second point, my argument is I don't see any evidence for this idea that evolution is a theory in crisis, which has been what the claim is. So the basic facts of evolution have not been challenged in a scientific arena. They've been challenged in a lot of other political arenas. So it's difficult for me to know what you mean by a middle ground. I don't see a middle ground on the facts of evolution. As I said, evolution is not speaking directly to issues of whether a God exists or not. We're really concerned with materialistic explanations for the diversity that's in the world. So perhaps that's an area for common ground. I'm not going to cede any common ground, though, on the basic facts of evolution as we've been able to determine them.
Okay, got another question up here? Or thought?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at a high school biology book probably for quite some time. But looking at college level books, although they may have separate chapters on evolution, it's really from chapter 1 on, it's pretty well integrated. And it's done so not for any sort of agenda. The biology actually makes sense in that context. Are high school level books done this way? If not, who's publishing them and why aren't they done this way? I guess.
Well, there are some good high school books, but because of the controversy, the Discovery Institute and other units have published supplements that they provide to individual teachers that teach the controversy and bring up these other issues that are not necessarily in the main book. So it's very complicated. There are lots of sources. Teachers have a lot of conflicting demands on exactly what they should or should not be teaching in the classroom.
Okay. Somebody want to follow up on that, or a new kind of semi?
Hi. So anyone who's followed this debate for a while is familiar with the teach the controversy thing as sort of the latest stage in the evolution of creationism, if you will.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So a thought I've had, and this is probably more applicable to a high school level than a college level, is could teaching the controversy actually be used in a good way? As in, could you present this in the context of a critical thinking unit or a unit on contrasting science and pseudoscience or something similar? Could that rhetoric be used to the advantage of solid science education?
I agree. I mean, this lecture that I give at UVM essentially does that. But this, of course, is not what the Discovery Institute has in mind when they talk about teaching the controversy. Their contention is that this is an alternative set of information that needs to be evaluated on the same level that evolution is. So their contention is that there's a whole alternative view that deserves equal time to evolution. Again, trying to call into question the idea that there is some problem with the facts or the theory of evolution. Right. But I do think, yes, that this is an effective role for education. And certainly I've found I do a much better job with my students presenting it this way than, as I told you before, trying to give this historical lecture on Darwinism right. that I thought would have been uncontroversial.
Yeah, right. And I mean, obviously there's problems because at a certain level, especially with elementary and high school levels, it's left in the hands of the individual teachers rather than
Sure. There's also, I think, a bigger philosophical debate about how much education should be based on exploring issues versus presenting foundational material. Mm-hmm. And my sense for the sciences is we have a long ways to go. We have a lot of foundational material we need to present. Mm-hmm. So again, in my teaching, there are lots of controversies in evolution and ecology. I don't bother with them until I get to my upper division classes because I want them to have the core material first right. so that then they can go on to understand those controversies.
Thank you.
Any question in the back there? Yes. Okay. Let's take one way back there.
I guess I have some question about the simple lumping together of young earth creationists, biblical literalists, and people who talk about intelligent design. It does appear to me when you talked, as you mentioned, about the question of the origin of life, that there are lots of legitimate questions about could this genuinely arise by chance. I think it was Dean Kenyon who had written a text on chemical predestination, which became, perhaps still is, a standard in the field, but represents a position that he's moved away from as he's continued his research. And there are others who, when you look at the humongous complexity of the simplest life forms, people talk about that, it seems to be more than astronomically rare event to occur by chance. And so I guess I wonder, is it fair to include, I mean, quite apart from other things about evolution for the moment, I don't want to talk about that, the possibility that, you know, you could acknowledge that there might be, if you want to say it one way, divine creation of even the first live cell, or more simply, perhaps put, some evidence of intelligent design simply because of for example, the complexity of DNA as deemed required by those who look, and a whole bunch of other things as well, in what would appear to be a viable first cell, live
Okay,
cell.
so I think what we're saying, you're asking, is there a possibility? Nick, what do you think?
Well, sure. I mean, as a scientist, we say there is always a possibility, but at some point, an overwhelming amount of evidence piles up that causes us, on practical basis, to accept one explanation or another. So my only response to you would be, these arguments are very interesting, but I have not seen them developed in the scientific literature.
Okay, sure. Nice and sweet and short.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it, but the
That'd
subject
be
is
great.
complex.
Yep.
I mean, I appreciate what you've said about volunteers and editors and reviewers and so on. That doesn't rule out, and just raise the topic, it's not my main question, about possible bias as a political matter to protect vested interests in scientists who have certain privileges that are in fact involved in grant money, receipt thereof, continuing their research as they see it, etc. But when we look at, again, the complexity of the appearance of first live cell, and that happened by chance. I mean, I have taught, I'm no longer teaching retired, but taught for many years epidemiology in medical schools. And we look at the odds of something appearing by chance, and if we rule out, because of statistical numbers, the likelihood that this could appear just by chance, we conclude, using an alternative hypothesis, that maybe another factor that was hypothesized was really occurring. And you have two basic hypotheses, however you want to state them, null or alternative. Either the first life cell arose by chance, or there was some intelligent form behind it. You know, I mean, it's either simply materialistic or some
These are interesting
intelligent.
ideas.
And the point is that the enormity of the odds against random, simple, materialistic formation are so incredibly great.
I'm going to ask both you and I to follow the restriction that I placed at the start of my talk, which is that we would not debate evolution and creationism. These issues that you have raised, though, have been thoroughly addressed in the literature, and I would invite you to attend my lectures on evolution, where I will speak at length on some of the issues that you have raised.
Okay, we got another question up here.
I don't really know the answer, but like, what's the constitutionality of doing creationism or teaching that in a school? Like, I don't know myself, but I figured there'd be teachers here that might know.
Well,
it's church and state, yeah, First Amendment stuff.
I think we've got somebody back here that wants to answer that. Is that okay?
Sure.
I've been studying this for a long time, and I'm a young Earth creationist, by the way. The only thing I took offense to is that you talk about flat earthers, but I'll leave that aside. Your question, you're talking about the Constitution. There's been a few landmark cases. Oh, I'm sorry. There's been
We got you.
There has been a few landmark court cases where this school district or that school district said that they wanted to mandate and force people to teach creation in the public school. I'm a young Earth creationist. I don't believe that that should be done. The law has stated clearly that you can't force a teacher to teach something they don't want to teach, and that, I agree with that 100%. But there is no law right now that says you can't teach creation in a public school. The only reason why it's not is because of fear and intimidation.
Okay, very good.
Well, I'm going to have to respond to that one. First, the First Amendment does actually prevent the teaching of creationism, which the courts have recognized repeatedly as advocating a religious position. This has come up in several court cases, most explicitly in the Dover 2005 case that went into a 130-page exposition of the creation elements. So I'm going to have to disagree with you on that one. From our perspective of teachers, what we want to do in the classroom is to give the most accurate, representation of the facts of evolution as we know them and the facts of Earth history, including the age of the Earth. So that is what frames our presentation of the material.
Okay, I got a long question here.
Okay.
Do you want me to read it or do you want to read it?
Is it a good long question?
I'm not sure. We're talking about micro and macro evolution. He's going to read through it, obviously, make a synopsis of this,
Okay.
and answer the question. So this
Sure,
is
let's
from
do this
online, online from somebody in Colorado. How cool is that? Welcome, Colorado.
It says, I taught in a small town in Colorado. The science department chose to address the controversial topic of evolution by only teaching microevolution, not macroevolution, and definitely never talking about humans in relation to evolution. The reason being that they didn't want to turn off students with strong religious beliefs. Is this a disservice? How do you respond to the idea of teaching micro and not macroevolution? Well, I think it's a disservice to the extent that you have cut out the most fascinating parts of biology, of evolution, and the part that students are most intrinsically interested in. The evolution of humans, the evolution of behavior, the evolution of social structures, and the evolution of new species. These are the topics that are taught by, in macroevolution. On the other hand, I'm delighted to learn that someone is teaching microevolution, the equations of population genetics. I'm very pleased to have high school students who have been exposed at least to that material. So if this is as bad as it gets, we're in pretty good shape.
Okay, are there other questions over here? Melissa, can you get over there with mic number 2? Thank you.
I have a follow-up to one of the earlier questions, and that is why, if scientists sort of dismiss out of hand the viewpoint of creationists because there's no scientific evidence, why don't creationists dismiss scientists in the same way and simply go about their business?
An excellent question. Why haven't they? Well, I would say they haven't been able to dismiss scientists because they have not published their criticisms in the scientific journals. They have not participated in the arena of science. We have 2 forums in which controversies in science are played out. And the first and most important of these is the scientific literature, which I described for you earlier. The second forum are scientific meetings, not debates, but meetings in which scientists present their works. There's an audience that will ask questions afterwards that oftentimes contains experts, and they can critique it there. So my question really is for the creationists, why aren't they participating what in this time we call science? If they've got such good arguments, present them. We are anxious to hear them, and so is everyone else. And that would give them the respect that they crave. That really would. That would shut up the evolutionists, but quick. So we just want to see it in the journals.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you're aware, are there any other nation states that are so fascinated with this science versus religious take? And is it possible that this is just a peculiarity of the West's notion of the individual being entitled to have their own opinion, you know, regardless of fact?
Okay, if you look at surveys of different countries on belief in evolution, our rankings in the U.S. for the average public are much closer to Middle East and countries in Islam. Okay, Western Europe and other countries, 80–90% belief in the evidence for evolution. I think it has to do a lot with the founding origins of this country and with the fact that this country was, in fact, started by religious sects who had somewhat extreme views compared to the Church of England, which they were escaping. And ironically, of course, that's where we end up with our separation of church and church and government in the First Amendment. This fear of having something like the Church of England that they were escaping oppression from. So there is this very important fundamentalist background to the origins of this country, and I think that does contribute to those attitudes.
Okay, I think we have another online question that I snuck up here. If a museum in any way references creationism, Does it legitimize the very issue because of a museum's position of integrity in its community?
Well, again, I guess I would say, what exactly is the reference to creationism that the museum is making? Many of my colleagues in paleontology are at the Smithsonian, and they would go on quite at length about some of the issues that are raised about creationism. So I don't think that museums or other institutes necessarily should tiptoe around these issues. That's part of the problem. The difficulty is that the creationists want to engage scientists in the format of a debate, and we just don't do these debates. But the problem is, from the perspective of the general public, it looks like we're trying to avoid the issue. We're not. We're simply asking that if there is a scientific critique, we want it played out in the same arena that we use for establishing the scientific facts. So no, I don't think that that legitimizes it. It really depends on what the museum says and exactly what is being discussed with creationism.
Okay, we've got a new question back here.
Yeah, this is sort of a flashback to your thing and a lot of what we've been talking about. I think it's important to recognize there are two agendas going on with the creation thing. There are what you might call ideological types that are with institutes, and I'm an evolutionary biologist, by the way, and a lot of these are booby traps for scientists to get pulled into because they can't argue against them. They can't explain why they know what they know, and they come across just sounding like they're operating on a faith basis, which the other folks are. And these guys are pros, and they rip them apart in public. So there's that. The other thing, though, is sincere people like we saw back here with real questions, and that can be a really effective teaching tool. I've taught at Paul Smith's evolution for about 15 years. I have creationists sit in on my class, and I make time at the end to say, hey, Randy, what do you think of what I just said? And he says, well, I don't agree with any of it. Can you explain why? And what we find out is, first of all, the kids get way more engaged because instead of just spoon feeding it, they have to defend a case. And if you can't defend it yourself, why are you teaching it? It's a whole other way of doing it, and it also shows respect for people with different opinions. So I can be great buddies with Randy, the creationist, because he's done it for so many years, he can actually give my lecture, which he did once when I had laryngitis. And he did it correctly and said, I don't believe a word of this, but here's what Kurt would say. It's a fantastic teaching tool, and you can get away with it in college, and I encourage that kind of thing. I think it's great, but there's another thing going on, which I think is mostly what you've been talking about, and I would agree it's not worth engaging them in that situation.
Okay, any other conversation or discussions or dialogue? Yes, sir.
One thing that bothers me the most is that children, really young children, will believe anything their parents tell them, generally. And my concern is that with kids brought up in a creationist family where the beliefs in their religion often are based, or base their views on science and religion, it's very difficult for a child to understand that there might be something else out there, that perhaps there's another point of view, and I see this being perpetuated generation after generation. And for an example, I was talking with a Mennonite a few months ago, and somehow the topic got into evolution. And the guy said, well, the Bible says this. Genesis 1 and 2 says this, and therefore it must be true. And I said, well, have you ever read a book about evolution written by an evolutionist? He said, no. I don't need to. I got everything I need to know here in the Bible. And I find that just so disappointing because they're missing out, I think, on a lot of real enjoyment in life in the sense of, wow, look at what we've learned about life in the universe. And this perpetuation of these religious beliefs, I realize that's what parents do, but at the same time, I wish they would consider that perhaps maybe they should give their child a little more license to think about other things. And
Well-
I was wondering what your comment is about that.
I mean, certainly I would agree with you. I'm sure we could find people in the audience who would not. But your comment does bring up an important point, which is sometimes all of these discussions kind of degenerate to the idea that, well, the problem is all simply in the schools and how we're teaching this material. And it's not. As you say, it does come very much back to how students bring this material home, what the influence is at the home level. As I said, we teach as best as we can, but we are kind of constrained to work with the material that we get, that is, the intellectual development of the students when they come to us. And so this all does come into play. Again, from our purposes, the problem is we're not willing to compromise the science as we know it simply to appease some aspects of the public, some portions of the public that may be unhappy with this program.
Okay, we got another comment here.
I'm a retired elementary school principal, and in Vermont, I think we're very fortunate with the Vermont standards that the elementary school curriculum, particularly here in Burlington, really stresses teaching the scientific method. Students come with a lot of misconceptions. The content is fairly simple and basic at the elementary level, but the assessment, the fourth grade assessment, the key part, or at least I believe the key part, is assessing whether the student can use the scientific method. And that, I think, is the critical piece. Congratulations to Vermont for standing up and making sure that that got into its assessment and its standards.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. I see a hand back there that hasn't had the microphone.
Just one comment about when people go to college, you get to pick which college you go to. So you're going to go to college that teaches what you want to learn about, but for elementary school and high school, you're stuck with whatever town you live in. So I would think parents would probably be afraid that the teacher's going to teach something that they don't agree with. And the only thing you can do about it is go to a private school and pay all that money, or even move to a different town.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Did you have a comment here?
Just kind of listening to everybody's comment, this has been a very interesting discussion, and I didn't really plan on even coming here tonight, but here I am. And I can remember as a young child being very confused about, gee, we went to church school and church, and we weren't very tremendously religious, but we did go to school on Sundays. And then as science came up, it was like, gee, here's what the church says and here's what the school says. And as a child, I was very confused about that and inquired with my parents, who I don't think they had a good grasp on, and I don't think I had a good grasp on when I raised children either, as to how to explain those two. And to me, it just kind of evolved into, finally I reached an age when I said, oh, well, this is spirituality and this is the facts and the reality. So it's an interesting challenge, I think, for children in particular in school systems to really deal with, you know, such a dichotomy of issues. So
I think it's not just children, though. When I give this lecture on creationism to my college audience, I will have some students who have not spoken up the whole semester really want to talk about this. Some of them are from families where they're getting a lot of pressure. Some of them, as you say, have their own questions that they are trying to work through. So, I mean, if it were up to me, I would never even bother with this, because this takes away one lecture from the material that I want to give. But I've come to feel that the issue is so important that I am willing to spend one lecture period on it. And clearly from the student comments, there is a huge amount of interest in this subject.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. I think we're going to, oh, you just raised your hand and haven't had it. All right, we got two. So go ahead back there. She's got a microphone right behind you.
I wanted to say something about, I guess you might say, the complexity of this argument. I want to mention something about me personally. In my heart, I'm a flat earther. My head tells me otherwise, but to be quite honest, it's a rather sophisticated argument, and for the most part, my heart doesn't want to listen. So, you know, I'm always open to having my heart convinced that the earth is anything but flat, but so far it hasn't been done.
Thank you for that comment. All right, last question.
Comment. Can you? Although we agree, I would first like to say thank you for handling such an incredibly difficult topic and handling it so well, by the way. And although I have my own opinions on the topic or on the answer that you may give, and this might be a softball question, but what do you think are some of the ramifications of teaching creationism in the science classroom? And again, we agree, I have my opinions, but I'm curious of what a professional might say.
Yeah, I feel as though it's undermining a basic premise of science. And the basic premise of science is to search for the truth using the scientific method. So once we start altering the content of our science courses in order to conform to public opinion or whatever else, we are compromising a huge piece of what it is that we actually call science. And that is something that most of us are simply not willing to do. And that's what I think the big issue is.
All right, another round of applause for Nick Gatelli.